Our third and final speaker is Claire Gilbert, who is an associate professor of early modern history at St. Louis University. She's the author of In Good Faith, Arabic Translation and Translators in Early Modern Spain, out from University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020, as well as articles and book chapters about the social history of translation and the political consequences of language contact in the Western Mediterranean. Her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the Newberry Library, the Huntington Library, the Fulbright Commission, and the Social Science Research Council. Her new research explores the history of language sciences in the early modern Mediterranean, with an emphasis on linguistic thought generated through contact between Arabic and Romance languages. And the title of her talk today is Mediterranean Creativity, Early Modern Artists and Artisans Between Spanish and Moroccan Courts.
Thank you very much, Maya. I'm just gonna multitask. There you go. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I want to join my co-panelists in thanking the organizers, Tom, Zrinka, T, the whole team, for this amazing opportunity. To thank everybody here in the audience for your attention and your comments and suggestions as part of our conversation. I'm going to share with you today part of a developing project about the circulation of artists, artisans, different kinds of expertise across I'm calling it the early modern Mediterranean, but I'd be happy to talk about periodization and maybe some of the limits there. And so Mohammed has just set me up really beautifully with his concluding thoughts. All right, so let's get started. We'll get started with the setting. So in the final decades of the 16th century, in the wake of a battle with powerful neighbors, which would define his sovereignty, a Mediterranean king commissioned a new palace. The king's territories were bordered on multiple sides by the Mediterranean, also the Atlantic. International politics knit him into a diplomatic theater which stretched across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. He eschewed a port city or the traditional capital as the site of this new palace, however. Nevertheless, it would provide a place of refuge as well as representation, where local officials, scholar officials, and foreign dignitaries vied for access to the innermost chambers of power. In addition to housing the royal court, this palace held a library, spaces for scholars and religious men to work and worship, large ornamented gardens, and a family crypt designed as a monument to the memory of this new dynasty. Now, to build and populate such a palace was no mean undertaking. Thousands of men and women labored for decades on the design, building, and decorating the complex, including expansive and manicured gardens, courtyards, fountains, all of which complemented the richly decorated buildings and interiors. Materials, craftsmen, and laborers from across the kingdom were conscripted into the project. Italian marble, African gold, all made their way across sea and sand roads towards the building site. Once it was completed, this palace became a central site for the theater of royal representation. News of the fabulous complex spread quickly, and visitors made widely publicized reports and drawings through which the world would learn of the splendor of this monument. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the history of Spain and royal architecture, which is many, if not most of you, if not all of you, you may have little doubt that I'm describing the Palace of the Escorial. This is an architectural complex built by Philip II between 1563 and 1584 in order to commemorate his victory against the French at Saint Quentin in 1557. Famously, Philip combined his plans for this monument with a royal crypt and one of the first public libraries. He summoned artists, craftsmen, and materials from across the Mediterranean, especially the Italian peninsula. And when completed, Philip and his architects imagined that the palace would reflect the same universal order and harmony that the Spanish king sought to bring to his territories and to display to rival sovereigns. This would certainly be an apposite conclusion. Now, some of you may have suspected that I am not describing the Escorial. Indeed, there was another project of monumental royal architecture carried out at very nearly the same time by another major Mediterranean Atlantic sovereign, which fits the description I've just given you. And this is the Palace of al-Badia, the incomparable, built by the Moroccan Sultan Aḥmad al-Manṣūr between 1579 and 1585 or 1594. He really continued to elaborate on the complex until his death in 1603. This palace is built in the new, that is not a new city, but a new capital city of Marrakesh. It was begun shortly after his ascension to the throne in the wake of the Battle of the Three Kings, so-called, in 1578, and meant to glorify the new Sharifan dynasty, to distinguish it from the previous Berber dynasties. According to the court historian Abdelaziz al-Fashtali, al-Manṣūr was using this monument to demonstrate his legitimacy in the face of the monuments which had been left by those preceding dynasties. Now, nevertheless, the audience was certainly not only the Muslim world, although local audiences were certainly incredibly important. This same court historian al-Fashtali reported that the lords and ministers of all governments, including from the lands of the Franks, had gathered at the building site. Europeans were also involved in the design and the construction of the palace, both as architectural consultants and in the form of captive labor from that 1578 victory. All right, so that two such similar projects were carried out nearly coterminously is a coincidence, but it's a productive coincidence for those of us who are seeking to understand these patterns of mobility and the circulation of resources, expertise, and cultural forms across the Mediterranean. Certainly, we can explain such a coincidence in terms of parallel campaigns for dynastic legitimacy that were being carried out across both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar. Both Philip and Aḥmad represented the second generation of a dynasty relatively new to power. They both experienced long and successful reigns, yet they were simultaneously challenged to fulfill opportunities of expansion while defending their spheres of influence closer to home. They were certainly well aware of each other's activities. They corresponded throughout the 1580s. They avidly consumed reports about their mutual artistic and architectural initiatives. For example, the Portuguese nobleman and captive from the battle, the 1578 battle, Antonio de Saldanha, reported in his autobiographical account of his captivity, and here he's talking about a later period in the 1590s, the Sharif continued to ennoble Marrakesh, arriving at never before seen heights after receiving the news that King Philip was bringing the Escorial to a point of perfection. One of the reports that Philip would then receive, also in the 1590s, about the infamous 7 martyrs of Marrakesh, which 7 Spanish subjects who had been executed by al-Manṣūr in 1585, includes the richly illustrated plan of the Badia Palace, which is to this day housed in the Escorial Library, and that's the far image that we have here. So both rulers were drawn to emulate political religious architecture, which helped connect them to a universalizing message. Philip employed as his first architect Juan Bautista de Toledo, who had worked on the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, amongst other projects. And al-Manṣūr, according to al-Fashtali and others, had sent out emissaries to seek information about the most renowned mosques in Islam, including the Qarawiyyin Mosque in Fez, and Tulun Mosque in Cairo, and the Great Mosque of Istanbul. So both rulers took a personal interest in architecture and design, reading treatises and manuals, and working closely with their architects, especially known in the case of Philip, and even writing about military architecture in the case of al-Manṣūr. I said one way that we know that they were doing this reading, at least in the case of al-Manṣūr, is because of the ijazat, the kind that Mohammed was just talking about. All right, nevertheless, despite these kind of interesting comparisons, there are more mundane serendipities which connected the two projects and the two rulers, and it's to the actual exchanges that I want to turn today. More specifically, I want to reconstruct what is known about one Spanish painter's journey and residence in Morocco from 1593 to 1598, in order to open a window onto the mobility of non-captive European artisans and artists across the Western Mediterranean at the turn of the 17th century. As elsewhere in the global Hispanic monarchy, such mobility supported the development of a discourse of service and expertise, which was legible both at home and abroad. And just as the construction and dissemination of news about these monumental royal projects consolidated the representations of sovereignty amongst the two monarchs, the exchanges which this construction fostered also helped consolidate the reputation for the individuals who made those exchanges possible. So the case that I will follow today is that of Blas de Prado, a Spanish painter born and based in Toledo, which was a major center of Spanish painting. Unfortunately, relatively few of his works are extant, and regrettably little is known about his life. Although he seems to have participated in the Escorial building projects, he oversaw some of the fresco works that were created in the Escorial. He was well known, however, in his own time, and he was certainly not forgotten by the following generations. So the civilian painter Francisco Pacheco, who is father-in-law to Velázquez, included Prado in his 1649 Arte de la Pintura, complementing the latter's skill with still life paintings. And in that work, Pacheco referred to Prado's journey to Morocco on the order of the king, so a royal commission, which is the first historiographic reference to the episode, which comes about a generation later. So art historians have identified these two previously anonymous fruit still lives attributable to Prado, perhaps not dissimilar to the paintings that Prado would have carried with him to the Moroccan court, as we can see in Pacheco's report about the journey. From this brief passage in 1649 onward, there's a fragmentary and sometimes seemingly embellished account of Prado's journey to Morocco that's been transmitted in print histories from the 17th century into the 19th century. For example, in the later 17th century, Giuseppe Martinez described how the Moroccan Sultan requested that Philip send him a renowned painter. According to this testimony, Blas de Prado was sent because of his reputation as a portraitist and his abilities to work with color. He was well received and well employed, according to this account, and he eventually requested a license to return to Madrid. And I highlight the license. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more in a moment, because of this connection to establishing your credentials and your reputation. So it was only in the 1980s that archival research finally began to confirm the details of this royal commission. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was the grandee and minister in charge of Spanish relations with North Africa, authorized the payment of 200 ducados for Blas de Prado's journey. He authorized this to his own agent in Morocco, who was a Genoese man named Baltasar Polo in 1593. So the question we have is, why was a painter exchanged between these sovereigns of Spain and Morocco at this time, which by the 1590s represents a period of kind of Cold War between the two powers because of the balance of various dynastic alliances around the Atlantic Mediterranean. So the scene into which Prado entered was full of international agents of all kinds. Indeed, as we know, it's already a commonplace that painters and paintings play a crucial role in international relations. And of course, it was not unheard of for European painters to be summoned to courts by Muslim rulers in order to paint for them. And I will, of course, show you perhaps the most famous example, which is the Bellini portrait of Mehmed II. Now, these agents, of course, had personal as well as political agendas, and sometimes the boundaries between the two were blurry. Indeed, there are new documents suggesting that Prado was involved in commercial missions as well as political and artistic mandates. The art historian Maria Teresa Cruz Yavar posits, for example, that the painter's commercial interests and those of his family in Cádiz in the wax trade with Morocco was one impetus for him to agree to take this royal commission, and it indicates that he actually probably made more than one journey across the straits between the 5-year period that he was based at the Moroccan court. So we're seeing how the boundaries between art markets, artisanship, international politics, and commerce are porous, to say the least. So I came across Blas de Prado during the course of research in the Spanish Royal Academy of History through the document here, which was interesting to me at the time because it had been translated in Morocco at the court of al-Manṣūr by an incredibly interesting figure named Abdulrahman al-Katani, who I have written about elsewhere. I'd be happy to talk about him if anybody has any questions. That's what interested me about this document initially, and not the corroborating evidence that it offered to this thin archival record about Prado. But today, this letter and its context and the related evidence around it can offer a means not just to update the details about this individual story, but to draw larger conclusions about the exchange of expertise by people, objects, and texts across the early modern Mediterranean. So from this case, I want to make two fairly simple points about the mobility of expertise, apropos of our panel, and the legibility of expertise. We'll talk about this in just a moment, but this is part of the credentialing that I just referred to. All right, so the backdrop for Prado's case is the diplomatic access of the Western Mediterranean, where Morocco after the 1570s became a crucial hub for an international system of competing commercial, religious, and political powers. Certainly, in the second half of the 16th century, contact and exchange were as robust as ever across the Western Mediterranean. So I'm not suggesting that there are not previous contexts, especially contexts between artists and artisans, which of course there are. However, our case today demonstrates how an aesthetics of sovereign power, which involves dynamics of representation, reputation, in this period, a kind of confessionalization, which might seem inward-looking, were in fact a motor for various registers of far-flung diplomatic, commercial, and artistic exchange. Part of this integration included the exchange of luxury goods like precious gems and political and aesthetic practices like royal portraiture, and even models for monuments to royal reputation, like, for example, the plans for the Escorial, which we have seen, which were produced in the 1580s. So the transfer of these practices and models was, of course, material and embodied. Prado, for example, carried with him the knowledge and practice of royal portraiture in the form of his own expertise. He also carried reference books. So the historian Margarita Vázquez Manacero has recovered the cédula de paso, which is kind of like his permission to travel, which Prado had to obtain before his departure. And he was given permission to take with him an unnamed 10 books of painting and of architecture. So he's taking a small library of architectural books with him to the building site. So the titles are unspecified, but we might make some conjectures about their contents. In 1593, there were relatively few Spanish books of painting and architecture that had been printed. Vitruvius's revived classic work, the 10 Books of Architecture, was still circulating primarily in manuscript. The first Spanish edition of Vitruvius was published in 1582, along with the first Spanish edition of Leon Bautista Alberti's treatise on architecture. Spanish architects, like the Andalusian Hernán Ruiz dynasty, had produced both print and manuscript books of architecture. And Blas de Prado is himself thought to have authored a treatise on painting, which is not extant, but was completed before his trip to Morocco because his student, Sánchez Cotán, had a copy. So certainly these books were used and circulated in manuscript amongst the architects in charge of constructing the Escorial, and they may be some of the same books which traveled with Prado to Marrakesh. So information about the two palace complexes certainly circulated across the Mediterranean in both directions in the 1580s and 1590s. Now, to what extent Prado participated in the actual decoration of Al-Badia, as he did in the Escorial with his work in the frescoes, remains an open question, as does the destiny of the books that he brought with him. Now, according to some of those earlier 17th century historiographic accounts, he had been sent specifically to paint royal portraits for al-Manṣūr. Moroccan chroniclers like the contemporaneous al-Fashtali, al-Tamagruti, or the slightly later al-Makari and al-Frani describe the richness of the building, but without any special indication that European decorative styles like, for example, paintings or frescoes are used. And I should say that the palace itself was destroyed, mainly destroyed in the early 18th century. I showed you a picture of the ruins, but we've lost a lot of the actual kind of physical evidence. However, both al-Fashtali and later al-Frani described networks of exchange with, for example, the Medici, who supplied Carrara marble, including columns and capitals, which had been sculpted in Italy prior to being transferred to Morocco. So certainly, there was some precedent, for adapting European decorative models and artisans that was set during al-Manṣūr's reign, because in 1623, his son, Moulay Zaidan, also requested a painter, Justus Stoyling, to undertake a series of frescoes also of the Al-Badia Palace. Stoyling was actually appointed as a royal painter to Zaidan in 1621, nominally for a period of 6 months, but this was extended to an unwilling period of more than 4 years. This required some diplomatic intervention on the part of the Dutch factor in Marrakesh. Zaydan repeatedly refused to liberate the painter to the Dutch agents, not only because of his great need for Stoyling to work in the palace. So what we have here are fragments which fit into a larger picture of exchange and emulation amongst nominally rival rulers in the early modern period. Now, although after 1588, al-Manṣūr is leaning more into his English alliance rather than a possible Iberian alliance, as coincides with the defeat of the Armada, the Habsburgs nevertheless remained important models and reflections for his claims to universal sovereignty. And these are claims, of course, which were being articulated largely for a domestic audience and against the Ottoman claims that are being made in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we have a salutary reminder here that exchange and emulation depended, however, on not on two kings in their kind of inland palaces, but rather on the bodies, objects, and texts, as well as ideas that were actually transported with some regularity across the Middle Sea. So in this light, that a painter from inland Toledo would have commercial and professional interests in the Moroccan wax trade that he could advance while he's on a royal commission should hardly surprise us. And it shouldn't surprise us either that a Moroccan sultan, fully embedded in a complex international system, should seek out expertise and artistic talent from rival states, which could help him achieve an iconography of reputation that was legible on both local and international scales. So it is to this idea of the legibility of expertise in this early modern Mediterranean world that I want to return very briefly, I promise, for the remainder of my time. So mobility, we know, these are some of the plans, excuse me, I should have showed you this before, of the Escorial that are, and the embodied that are circulating around the Mediterranean in the 16th, 17th, and even into the 18th centuries. All right, so mobility is, of course, a physical translation, we know that. However, while the physical translation of ideas and texts is important alongside its linguistic and cultural counterparts, we shouldn't forget that the success of any translation relies on intelligibility or legibility in the target culture. So al-Manṣūr's success and that of his heirs in creating an iconography of imperial rule that was legible to Moroccans, Ottomans, and European powers relied on a kind of translation of values which, of course, depended on its audience. This success was manifested in al-Manṣūr's reputation amongst other sovereigns, and was also a central preoccupation to him, as was the reputation and its legibility of all early modern rulers, Philip included. However, reputation and its legibility was also important for non-sovereigns like Blas de Prado, and we see this communicated very clearly in the 1598 letter. So the letter itself, this is a copy. Unfortunately, the original is not extant, nor is the Arabic extant, but this copy nevertheless illuminates several interesting points. So first of all, it confirms that Prado is indeed sent by royal commission. He's sent as a professional painter on an official delegation from one king to the other. So he's not sent to pursue his own agenda in the wax trade, but he's supposed to go because of his claro oficio, right? He was discharged this task designated by his special skills as a painter. Al-Manṣūr was writing about this with the specific intention of providing the certification. This is a certification for the quality and completeness of his service in Morocco. Nominally, that service took place at least partially in Philip's name. Now, this is a credential that was meant to be legible in the economy of Mercedes, which is shaping patron-client relations across the Hispanic monarchy. And finally, the certification is designed to accompany a specific petition, also not extant, which Prado made on his own account, requesting salaries and various titles. Okay, so to conclude, while embedded in the international interests and networks which imbued the Moroccan court, Prado may very well have become involved in multiple commercial activities like the wax trade or the purchase of precious gems. Certainly his connection with Al-Qahtani and Baltasar Polo, both of whom were highly adept at working across national boundaries from the Moroccan court, securing goods and favors, make it likely that Prado did not reserve himself to painting at the court, but took advantage of his position to carry out political as well as personal commercial missions. He would have been far from exceptional in such pursuits, either within the international system, which was intersecting at al-Manṣūr's court, or as a general artistic envoy sent to any court across the Mediterranean or across Europe. And we could think about a comparative example like Rubens. So back in Spain in 1598, Prado once again took up his paintbrushes for the new King Philip III, and he continued to produce still lives until his death in 1599 or 1600. And this brings me to the final counterpoint that we have of the story of Blas de Prado's transmission of its expertise and its return to Spain. So al-Mahdi, I had mentioned, like the Escorial, was designed to house the royal library, or actually multiple royal libraries. It was part of the same library that was captured in 1611 and transferred to Spain, where it remains in the Escorial collections to this day, at least the part that was not destroyed in a later 17th century fire. And we have, as part of that collection, the famous Quran of Moulay Zaidan. This is the son who commissioned the Dutch painter. Nevertheless, the colophon reveals that it was originally commissioned for al-Manṣūr, and it was completed in 1599 at the al-Badia Palace in Marrakesh. Just over a decade later, the volume and its companions found themselves in a setting that was at once new and familiar, the Escorial. These placements, contingent upon the messy histories of contact and conflicts, are an important reminder that the spaces and aesthetics traditionally associated with inward-looking political and religious visions were in fact constructed amidst intense exchanges and even across confessional lines. These exchanges were motivated and embodied by individuals with multivalent experiences and agendas, and they knit together a space of simultaneous diversity and mutual intelligibility, which allows us to recognize these transregional connections if we start on the scale of individual experiences. Thank you.